No lawyer, no money, no chance. Just sign the papers and stop embarrassing yourself. Nathan Caldwell said it standing up in open court, pointing his finger directly at his wife's face. Then he reached across the table and shoved her folder 3 months of her handwritten notes. Every document she had prepared alone at midnight off the edge. The papers scattered across the floor. Lauren dropped to her knees to gather them. Nathan laughed. His attorney said nothing. The bailiff looked away. Every person in that courtroom watched a woman collect her dignity off the floor. And not one of them saw what was about to walk through that door. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it, because what happened next in that courtroom changed everything. Lauren Whitmore was 51 years old the morning. She walked into the Harris County Family Court in Houston, Texas, carrying a folder that had seen better days. The edges were soft from handling. The cover was creased in 3 places. Inside, she had organized everything she could think of: bank statements, photographs, a handwritten list of dates and events she had recorded over the last 2 years. In a small notebook she kept hidden inside a winter coat Nathan never wore. She had done all of this herself at the kitchen table, after midnight when the house was quiet and Nathan was asleep upstairs. She had no attorney. She had tried to find one. She had made calls. She had filled out online intake forms for 4 different law offices. 2 never called her back. One told her that without a retainer of $8,000, they could not take her case. The 4th one told her to apply for legal aid, which she did, but the waiting list was long and the hearing date was fixed. The court was not going to wait for her circumstances to align. So she came alone. She wore a navy blue blazer she had pressed herself the night before. Her hair was neat. Her posture was careful. From the outside, she looked composed. On the inside, she was running through every possible version of how this day could go wrong. She had been doing that for months. Nathan Caldwell, her husband of 8 years, walked into that same courtroom 20 minutes after she did, and the contrast between them was immediate and complete. He wore a charcoal gray suit that Lauren recognized. She had picked it out for him 3 years ago when he had an important meeting with an investor from Dallas. She remembered the day because he had kissed her on the cheek when he got home that evening and said the meeting had gone perfectly. She had made dinner. He had poured wine. For one evening, the marriage had felt like something real. That was a long time ago. Nathan walked in the way Nathan always walked into any room, like he already owned it. His attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who ran a boutique family law firm in the Galleria area, walked beside him carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Lauren's monthly grocery budget. Gerald had a reputation. Lauren had looked him up. He had handled high-asset divorce cases for 2 decades, and his win rate was the kind of number that got quoted in legal industry publications. Nathan had been paying Gerald Fitch for the better part of a year. Lauren had a worn folder and a handwritten list. When Nathan spotted her sitting alone at the defendant's table, he paused. He looked at the empty chair beside her. He looked at the absence of any second briefcase, any second chair pulled close, any second person who might be on her side, and then something crossed his face, not quite surprise. Because he had known she had no representation, he had made sure of it, but something closer to satisfaction. A confirmation of an outcome he had already decided. He leaned toward Gerald and said something quietly. Gerald nodded. Nathan straightened his jacket and took his seat. The courtroom had about 30 people in it. Not all of them were there for the Caldwell case. Some were waiting for their own hearings. Some were family members who had come to observe. The court reporter sat at her station. A clerk moved quietly near the bench. The bailiff stood near the door with the patient expression of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing in a very long time. Judge Patricia Harmon entered at 9:14. She was 63 years old, had been on the family court bench for 19 years, and wore reading glasses on a chain that rested against her robe when she wasn't using them. She had a reputation for being fair and for having very little patience for theatrics. She settled her documents, looked over the room, and was about to call the case to order when Nathan Caldwell did something that altered the entire trajectory of the morning. He stood up before he was asked to. "Your Honor," he said, and his voice carried with the ease of someone who had spent decades in rooms where other people deferred to him. "I want to note for the record that my wife has chosen to appear today without legal counsel. I want to make sure the court is aware that this is her choice, not a result of any obstacle on my part. I offered her access to funds for representation. She declined." He let that sit in the air for a moment. I just want to make sure the court understands we are not responsible for her situation. Lauren's jaw tightened slightly. She did not look at him. He had not offered her access to funds. He had frozen the joint account 8 months ago, during a weekend when she was visiting her friend Carol in Galveston. She had come home to discover that her debit card no longer worked at the grocery store. When she confronted Nathan, he had said, with complete calm, that he had moved the money into a business account for tax purposes. He said it as if it were obvious, as if she were slow for not understanding. As if the timing right at the moment their marriage was visibly collapsing had nothing to do with strategy. That was Nathan's particular skill. He could do something deliberate and harmful and then describe it in language so reasonable that you found yourself apologizing for misunderstanding him. Judge Harmon looked at Nathan over her reading glasses with an expression that did not change. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I appreciate your statement. Please sit down and allow me to conduct my courtroom." Nathan sat. A small pulse of something passed through Lauren when she heard that. She looked down at her folder. She straightened the papers inside it with both hands, just to give her hands something to do. Gerald Fitch spoke next. He was measured, professional, organized. He laid out Nathan's position efficiently, that the marital assets were primarily derived from Nathan's business interests, that Lauren's contributions to the household had been largely domestic in nature and therefore did not entitle her to an equity stake in the business holdings, and that the proposed settlement offered Lauren a fair and reasonable financial foundation going forward. He slid a document across to the clerk. It was a 12-page settlement proposal. Lauren had received a copy 2 weeks ago. She had read it 4 times. She had looked up legal definitions for 8 different terms she did not understand. She had sat at her kitchen table with a yellow highlighter and marked every section that seemed wrong, and the document was almost entirely yellow by the time she finished. It offered her 6 months of transitional support, a car that was 3 years old and needed new brakes. No portion of the equity in the house, no portion of the business, the investment accounts or the various LLCs Nathan had structured over the years. The proposal framed all of this as generosity. Lauren had stared at it in the quiet of her kitchen and felt something she could not name. It was beyond anger. It was something deeper and colder and more exhausting than anger. It was the feeling of watching someone take everything from you while smiling and calling it a gift. She had not signed it. That was why they were here. Judge Harmon was about to turn to Lauren and ask her to present her response when Nathan spoke again. He did not stand this time. He spoke from his seat, which was somehow worse, the casualness of it, the assumption that his interruption would be tolerated because his interruptions always were. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this feels unnecessary. My wife is going to say she deserves half of everything I built. But she didn't build it. I did. She organized some files, answered some emails, and attended some dinners. That's a supportive spouse, not business partner. I think the court will see that the numbers speak for themselves." He glanced at Lauren when he said it. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second, then she looked back down at her folder. She had learned years ago that looking at Nathan directly gave him some confirmation, that he had landed the hit, that the words had reached her the way he intended. She had taught herself to take the blow without showing the mark. It was a survival skill she had developed slowly, without noticing she was developing it, the way you adjust your posture over years without realizing you have been leaning. Judge Harmon set down her pen. "Mr. Caldwell, I am going to ask you one more time to please allow this proceeding to occur in the manner that I direct it. If you have points to make, you will make them through your counsel at the appropriate time." "Are we clear?" "Of course, Your Honor," Nathan said. He adjusted his cufflink. "I apologize." He did not look apologetic. He looked like a man who had just established something he wanted to establish, and was perfectly comfortable with the reprimand, because the reprimand didn't change what he had said. Lauren opened her folder and found her handwritten notes. She had prepared a statement. She had rewritten it 11 times over the past 3 weeks. She knew it was not the same as having legal representation. She knew that a handwritten statement from a non-attorney was not the same as the kind of strategic presentation Gerald Fitch was about to deliver. But it was what she had. She had just touched the first page of her notes when the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet mechanical sound of the door swinging inward on its hinge. But something about it stopped the room. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was some quality in the footsteps that followed, measured, unhurried, completely certain. The bailiff looked up. The court reporter turned her head. Gerald Fitch shifted in his chair. Lauren did not look up immediately. She was still looking at her notes. She was still trying to hold on to the composure she had been maintaining since 7 o'clock that morning, when she had sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before she could make herself get out. But then she heard Nathan make a sound. It wasn't a word. It wasn't quite audible enough to be a word. It was a sound he made when something surprised him in a way he didn't like, a compressed, controlled exhalation that she had learned, over 8 years, meant that something had not gone according to his plan. She looked up. A man was walking toward the front of the courtroom. He was tall, not unusually so, but tall enough that the room felt him before he reached the bar. He wore a dark gray suit, well fitted, with a white shirt and a tie that was a deep burgundy. He carried a leather briefcase, worn in a way that suggested use rather than neglect, the leather of someone who worked with it, not someone who displayed it. His hair was dark with gray at the temples. His face was composed in the specific way of someone who had spent years in rooms where the stakes were high and the margin for visible emotion was narrow. He walked to the bar and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, I apologize for my late arrival. My name is Daniel Cross. I am a licensed attorney in the state of Texas, and I am here today to represent Mrs. Lauren Whitmore." The room was absolutely still. Lauren's hands stopped moving. Her fingers were still resting on the edge of her notes. The paper was still, her breath was still. She was looking at the man who had just said her name. Something was happening inside her that she could not process in real time. It was too large and too complicated, and it was arriving all at once, the way some things do not gradually, not in pieces, but all at once in a single wave that you either absorb or you drown in. Because she knew that face. She knew it the way you know something that belongs to the deepest part of your memory. Not the recent memory that you access consciously, the kind you retrieve when someone asks you to recall something. The other kind, the kind that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. She had last seen that face when she was 10 years old. She had spent 41 years telling herself she would never see it again. Nathan had turned in his chair. He was looking at the man, at Daniel, with an expression that Lauren had almost never seen on her husband's face. Uncertain. "Your Honor," Nathan said, and for the first time all morning, his voice had lost its smoothness. This attorney was not listed in any of the pre-hearing filings. "He cannot simply appear, Mr. Caldwell." Judge Harmon's voice was quiet and precise. "Mr. Fitch, is there a procedural objection you wish to raise on behalf of your client?" Gerald Fitch was already on his feet. "Your Honor, we would note that this representation was not disclosed through the standard channels, and we reserve the right to request a continuance to review." Daniel Cross set his briefcase on the table beside Lauren. He did not appear to be hurried. "Your Honor," he said, "I apologize for any procedural inconvenience. I filed my notice of appearance this morning with the clerk's office. The filing time was 7:48 a.m., which is within the court's requirements. I also called ahead to advise the court staff of my late arrival due to a flight delay from Austin. I have confirmation of that communication." He opened his briefcase, produced a document, and held it out to the clerk. "The notice was filed, the appearance is proper, and my client has a right to counsel." Judge Harmon looked at the document. She looked at Daniel, she looked at Nathan's table. Then she said, with a flatness that settled the matter completely, "Mr. Cross's appearance is proper, we will proceed. Mr. Fitch, your objection is noted for the record. Mrs. Whitmore's right to counsel will not be abridged." Nathan said something under his breath. Gerald Fitch put his hand briefly on Nathan's arm, the practiced gesture of an attorney managing a client who was about to do something counterproductive. Daniel sat down beside Lauren. He placed the briefcase on the floor. He folded his hands on the table, and then he turned to look at her. For a moment, just a moment, the composure he wore like a second suit became something else. Something quieter, something that had nothing to do with the courtroom, with the judge, with the case, with any of the professional machinery that surrounded them. "Hey," he said, quietly, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear. Lauren's throat closed. She had promised herself she would not cry today. She had made that promise firmly and deliberately, and she had kept it all morning through things that would have made other people cry. She kept it now, but only barely. "Hey," she said back. Then he turned to face the front of the courtroom, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a stack of documents that was considerably thicker than anything Gerald Fitch had brought. And Nathan Caldwell, who had laughed in this courtroom less than 20 minutes ago, who had told his wife she should just sign the papers and save everyone's time, began to understand that the morning was not going to go the way he had planned it. He leaned toward Gerald and whispered something sharp and low. Gerald whispered something back. Nathan's jaw tightened, because Gerald's whispered response, whatever it was, had not been reassuring. And that was when Lauren, who had sat in her car for 11 minutes that morning trying to find the courage to walk inside, who had held a worn folder against her chest because it was the only armor she had, who had spent 8 years being told she was powerless in a marriage that was built around making her believe it, that was when Lauren allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to sit up straight. Not because she was not afraid, she was still afraid. Fear doesn't dissolve that quickly. 8 years of fear doesn't dissolve in 5 minutes because someone walks through a door. But something else was present now. Something that had been buried so long she had stopped knowing it was there. She looked at the documents Daniel had placed on the table. She looked at the thickness of them. She looked at the quiet certainty of the man beside her. The older brother she had been told was gone. The boy who had once told her he would always find her. The man who had apparently kept that promise across 41 years and one courtroom door. She looked at Nathan Caldwell, who was currently leaning toward his very expensive attorney, with an expression that had lost every trace of amusement. And she thought, I walked in alone, and I am still here. Whatever came next, that was already true. That was already something no one could take back. Nathan looked across the room at her then, their eyes met. And Lauren saw that flicker, that microscopic recalibration as Nathan processed the possibility, for the first time, that he had miscalculated something important. She held his gaze. She did not look away, and Nathan was the one who broke the eye contact first, which was not the way it usually went between them. Not the way it had gone for 8 years, which meant that today, whatever else happened, whatever the documents contained, whatever arguments Daniel Cross had prepared today, was already different from every day that had come before it. The clerk called the case. Judge Harmon settled her reading glasses on her nose, and Daniel Cross opened the first document in the stack, placed it carefully in front of him, and began the quiet, methodical process of telling the full truth about Lauren Whitmore's marriage. All of it, every piece Nathan had hoped would stay buried. Every number that had been moved, every account that had been hidden, every decision that had been made to ensure that when Lauren walked into this courtroom, she would walk in alone and leave with nothing. Nathan had planned this for a long time. He had been very thorough. He had thought of nearly everything. But he had not thought of one thing. He had not thought about the door at the back of the courtroom, and who might walk through it. He had not thought about the fact that Lauren Whitmore, who had grown up in circumstances that Nathan Caldwell had never asked enough questions to understand, had a brother who had spent 20 years becoming exactly the kind of person you wanted beside you when everything was on the line. Nathan had done his research on Lauren. He had simply done it wrong. He had researched the woman he believed she was isolated, dependent, without resources, without allies. He had not researched the woman she actually was. The woman who had survived things that would have broken most people. The woman who had held on quietly, without making a scene, without dramatic declarations, just held on because somewhere in her, in a place Nathan had never been able to reach no matter how long or how methodically he tried, she had never quite believed she was as alone as he wanted her to feel. And it turned out she was right. It turned out that somewhere, across the years and the distance and all the silence that had accumulated between them, her brother had been looking. He had been looking for a long time. And when he found her, when he finally found her, he did not ask what she needed. He already knew. He had known her when she was 10 years old, and he had never stopped knowing her, and he came to that courtroom with everything he had. The clerk finished calling the case. Judge Harmon looked up from her paperwork. Nathan sat rigid in his chair. Gerald Fitch arranged his own documents with the slightly more careful movements of an attorney who had just realized the morning required more attention than he had initially allocated to it. And Lauren Whitmore sat at the table with her brother beside her and her worn folder in front of her. She did not need the folder anymore, but she kept it on the table anyway, because she had carried it this far and it had carried her. The papers were still damp when Daniel Cross spread them carefully across the table in front of Lauren. He didn't comment on the water stains. He didn't ask what had happened before he arrived. He had seen the scattered pages when he walked in. He had seen Lauren on her knees gathering them. He had seen Nathan's face in that moment, the particular expression of a man who enjoyed what he had just done. Daniel had filed that information away without showing a single trace of having processed it. That was something he had learned in 22 years of practicing law. You don't let the other side see what you've noticed. Not yet. You save it, because in a courtroom what you save is often more powerful than what you spend. He opened his briefcase and placed a fresh set of documents in front of Lauren. Don't use those, he said quietly, nodding toward her damp folder. Use mine. Everything you had, I have a cleaner copy of. Lauren looked at him. How do you have copies of mine? I've been preparing for this for 6 weeks, he said. Simply, without drama, as if 6 weeks of preparation for a hearing he wasn't officially part of was the most natural thing in the world. Lauren stared at him for a moment, then she set her wet folder aside and pulled his documents toward her. Across the room, Nathan leaned toward Gerald Fitch and whispered something that made Gerald's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. Gerald whispered back. Nathan's jaw moved. Gerald put a hand briefly on Nathan's forearm, the practiced restraint of an attorney managing a client who is operating on emotion when he should be operating on strategy. Nathan pulled his arm away. That small gesture, Nathan pulling away from his own attorney's advice, told Daniel everything he needed to know about how Nathan was going to behave for the rest of the morning. Controlled people don't pull away. People who are beginning to feel cornered pull away. Good, Daniel thought, let him feel cornered. He has not seen anything yet. Judge Harmon called the proceeding to order and indicated that since Nathan's counsel had already made an opening statement, it was now appropriate for Lauren's counsel to respond. Daniel stood. He did not have notes in his hand. He stood with both hands resting lightly on the table, and he spoke the way people speak when they know the material so thoroughly that the words come from somewhere deeper than preparation. Your Honor, Mr. Fitch presented this case to the court as a straightforward division of assets in which my client Kent contributed minimally and is therefore entitled to minimally. I want to address that characterization directly because it is not accurate, and I intend to demonstrate, through documentation that has already been submitted to this court, exactly how inaccurate it is, not for effect, simply because the next sentence required its own space. My client contributed 8 years of her life to a marriage and a business that she was systematically excluded from, not because she lacked the ability to participate, but because her exclusion was deliberate and strategic. Nathan made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Judge Harmon looked at him once, briefly, and he stopped. Daniel continued, I am going to ask this court to look not just at what Mrs. Whitmore is being offered in this settlement, but at the full picture of what this marriage actually was. Who built it, who sustained it, and who decided at a certain point that the person who built and sustained it was inconvenient. Gerald Fitch was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor, counsel is making characterizations without evidentiary, Mr. Cross, Judge Harmon said. Please confine your opening statement to what you intend to establish through evidence. Of course, Your Honor. Daniel nodded. Everything I just said I will establish through evidence. He sat down. Lauren was watching him. She had been watching him since he walked through the door, trying to reconcile the man beside her with the boy she remembered. The boy had been 16 when she last saw him. He had been wearing a blue jacket with a broken zipper on the left pocket. She remembered the jacket because she had held on to the sleeve of it once when they were walking somewhere fast in the dark, and the zipper pull had scratched her palm. She still had a small, faint scar on her left hand from that night. She didn't let herself go further into that memory. Not now, not here. She would need to think clearly for the next several hours, and those memories were not something she could think clearly through. Gerald Fitch began presenting his evidence. It was organized and professional. He had financial records, tax documents, business valuations. He had a clear narrative. Nathan Caldwell had built a real estate development company over 15 years through his own vision, his own risk-taking, and his own professional network. Lauren had married him 7 years into the company's existence. The company's most significant growth had occurred before Lauren entered the picture. Therefore, the company's value was Nathan's, and Lauren's claim to any portion of it was unsupported. He presented a financial expert who testified for 40 minutes. The expert used words like premarital appreciation and separate property designation and business valuation methodology. He was thorough and credible and clearly expensive. Nathan sat with his hands folded, looking like a man listening to someone confirm what he had always known to be true. Lauren looked at the documents in front of her. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel was writing something on a legal pad, just notes. But his face had the quality of someone listening to music he has heard before and is waiting for the part where the composer makes a mistake. When the financial expert concluded, Gerald Fitch settled back with the confidence of someone who had just delivered a well-argued foundation for his client's position. Judge Harmon looked at Daniel. Mr. Cross, you may cross-examine. Daniel stood. He picked up exactly 3 pages from his stack of documents and walked toward the witness. Good morning, he said to the financial expert. I have a few questions. In your valuation of Caldwell Development Group, did you include the revenue generated from the Meridian Heights project? The expert glanced at his notes. Yes, Meridian Heights was included in the overall valuation. And what was the revenue from that project? Approximately $11.4 million. And when did that project close? Was finalized Fraklintstussabun? And can you tell the court who managed the subcontractor coordination for that project for the 18 months leading up to that closing? A pause. Brief. Almost imperceptible. The records I reviewed indicated that operational management was handled through the Caldwell Development internal team. I understand that's what the records indicate. My question was more specific. Do you know who specifically managed subcontractor coordination? By name? Another pause. Longer this time. I don't have that specific information. Daniel nodded slowly, as if this was not a surprise. Would it affect your valuation to know that the person who managed subcontractor coordination for Meridian Heights, the person who was in direct communication with 14 different contractors, who resolved 3 significant contract disputes that, if unresolved, would have delayed closing by at minimum 6 months, was Lauren Whitmore? My client, the woman being described in this proceeding as someone who answered emails and attended dinners. The courtroom shifted. Not loudly, but the quality of the silence changed. The financial expert looked uncomfortable. If that information had been in the records I reviewed— It wasn't in the records you reviewed, Daniel said. That's exactly what I want the court to understand. It wasn't there because it was never documented, Mrs. Whitmore's contributions were systematically excluded from the official record of this company. Not by accident, not by oversight, by choice, Gerald Fitch objected. Judge Harmon overruled it. Daniel returned to the table, set down his 3 pages, and picked up a different document. Nathan was no longer sitting with his hands folded. His right hand was flat on the table, pressing down. Lauren recognized that. She had seen it at home at the kitchen table, at his desk when something was happening that he needed to control. His hand pressing flat against a surface was how Nathan anchored himself when he was working to stay calm. She had never been in a room where someone else made his hand do that. The next portion of the hearing moved quickly. Gerald presented additional documentation, household financial records, the proposed settlement breakdown, testimony about Nathan's investment decisions over the years. All of it was designed to paint a portrait of Nathan as the sole architect of everything they owned. It was competent, it was well-sourced. It rested on the assumption that no one had dug what that the official records had left out. That assumption was about to become very expensive. During a brief recess, Lauren and Daniel sat together at their table while the room moved around them. She had 100 things she wanted to say to him. She could feel them crowding behind her sternum, pressing forward, fighting for order. She didn't know where to begin. She didn't know if she should begin at all, not here. Not now, not with the hearing resuming in 8 minutes. She settled for one question. How did you find me? Daniel looked at her. He had an expression. She didn't have a name for something between pain and resolution. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they were always going. I never stopped looking, he said. It took me a long time. But I found you about 2 years ago. Lauren's breath caught. 2 years. I needed to be sure you were safe before I made contact. And then when I saw what was happening with the marriage, I started preparing. You prepared for 2 years? I built a file for 14 months, he said. The last 6 I focused specifically on the divorce. Lauren didn't know what to do with that. The scope of it, the quiet, persistent, 2-year presence of someone looking for her, watching over her from a distance she couldn't see, was too large to absorb in the middle of a courthouse recess. Why didn't you just call me? She said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Because I needed to know I could protect you before I walked in the door, he said. I wasn't going to find you just to lose you again. Lauren pressed her lips together. She turned and looked straight ahead at the front of the courtroom. Okay, she said, then let's not lose. When the hearing resumed, Daniel stood and addressed the court with the document he had been holding during the recess. Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence Exhibit 14, which is a series of email communications between Nathan Caldwell and 3 of his business associates between January and September of last year. Gerald was on his feet immediately. Objection, privilege, relevance. These communications are between Mr. Caldwell and individuals who are not his legal counsel, Daniel said. There is no privilege, and the relevance will be immediately apparent. Judge Harmon allowed it. Daniel distributed copies to the clerk, to Gerald, and placed one in front of Lauren. Then he read not all of it, Just 3 selections, 3 specific exchanges. The first was Nathan writing to a business associate in February of last year. In it, Nathan described the anticipated divorce proceeding and noted that he had, as he put it, restructured certain accounts to ensure that what Lauren could reasonably claim was limited. He used the phrase clean exit. He used the phrase she won't know where to look. The second was from March. Nathan writing to a different contact asking for advice on a specific LLC structure. The purpose of the LLC, as described in the email, was to hold assets that Nathan did not want exposed in a marital proceeding. The third was from August. 7 months ago, Nathan writing to a third contact, and this time the language was different, less business. More personal. Daniel read it aloud. She has no idea how any of this works. She trusts me completely. That's actually been the most useful thing about this marriage. She never questioned the finances. Never asked, so there's nothing to find. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her as long as I present it right. The courtroom was completely silent. Not the polite quiet of an attentive audience, the deep, compressed silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that cannot be unheard. Judge Harmon set down her pen. Lauren kept her eyes forward. She had known, in the way you know things you have not allowed yourself to say out loud, that Nathan had not thought of her as a partner. She had felt it in 1,000 small moments over 8 years, in the way he explained things to her in a particular tone, in the way he moved money around and described it afterward as something technical that she wouldn't need to understand, in the way he stopped asking her opinion and started presenting her with outcomes. She had known, but hearing him say it in his own words, his actual words written down in an email to a friend, was a different thing entirely. It was the difference between suspecting you are invisible and someone handing you a photograph of the empty space where you were standing. Nathan spoke. He did not stand. He did not raise his hand. He simply spoke, and his voice was a controlled, dangerous quiet that Lauren recognized as the tone Nathan used when he was furious and working very hard not to show it. Those emails are taken out of context. Daniel looked at him. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Harmon said firmly. They were strategic conversations about business restructuring, Nathan continued. Not stopping. Any business owner has those conversations. Taking 3 emails out of 40,000 and presenting them as Mr. Caldwell. The judge's voice was sharper now. You will speak through your counsel or you will not speak. I will not tell you again. Nathan closed his mouth, but his eyes were on Daniel, and Daniel held the look without expression, without hurry, without any indication that Nathan's fury was registering as a threat. Gerald Fitch was writing something rapidly on his legal pad. He slid it toward Nathan. His jaw moved. He looked away. The hearing continued. Daniel presented the next piece of evidence, financial records showing a series of transfers over the previous 18 months. 11 separate transfers ranging from $200,000 to $1.4 million. Moved from joint or marital adjacent accounts into LLCs and holding entities that had been established in the previous 2 years. The total across all 11 transfers was just over $6 million. $6 million that had been moved methodically and quietly out of the marital estate before the divorce filing. Lauren had known the finances were wrong. She had felt it the way you feel weather changing, not through specific knowledge, but through a kind of atmospheric shift, the frozen account. The vague explanations, the increasingly elaborate corporate structures Nathan mentioned in passing. She had felt it and told herself she was misreading it, and then felt it again. Sitting in this courtroom watching Daniel lay out the actual numbers was something she had not been prepared for. Not because the betrayal surprised her, because the scale of it did. $6 million he had moved. $6 million. While telling her the joint account was frozen for tax purposes. While telling her she should be grateful for the settlement he was offering her. While laughing at her in open court for not having a lawyer. Nathan's face had gone through several transitions in the last 10 minutes. It had started at controlled fury. It had moved through something that might have been calculation, the look of a man rearranging his strategy in real time. And now it was at something Lauren had almost no reference point for, because she had almost never seen it on her husband's face. It was close to fear, not the way ordinary people look afraid. Nathan was not an ordinary person when it came to emotional control, but there was a tightness around his eyes, a stillness to his body that was different from the confident stillness of earlier in the morning. This stillness was the stillness of an animal that has just realized it is in a smaller space than it thought. Gerald Fitch requested a brief recess. Judge Harmon granted 10 minutes. The moment they were off the record, Gerald pulled Nathan out of his chair and walked him to the far corner of the room. Whatever Gerald said to his client in those 10 minutes, He said it in a low voice with his back partially turned and his body positioned in the deliberate way of someone ensuring privacy. Nathan listened. Nathan's head was slightly lowered. That alone was remarkable. Nathan Caldwell did not lower his head when someone talked to him. At the table, Lauren turned to Daniel. $6 million, she said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady through an act of will that she could feel in her back teeth. $6,240,000, Daniel said. There may be more. These are the transfers I was able to document through traceable accounts. There are 3 entities I haven't been able to fully trace as yet. 3 more, possibly. I don't want to present a number I can't prove, but yes. Possibly more. Lauren looked at her hands on the table. He told me we needed to simplify the business structure, she said. Last year, when I noticed some accounts had changed, he sat down with me at the kitchen table and he explained that it was a tax efficiency strategy. He drew a diagram. He made it sound completely routine. And I believed him, she stopped Lauren, Daniel said. I believed him, she said again, not with anger, with something more complicated. The particular exhaustion of someone who has spent a long time arguing with their own perception. He was very good at this, Daniel said. That's not a reflection of your judgment. That's a reflection of how thoroughly and deliberately he constructed the deception. People who do this, it's not a moment of bad behavior. It's a sustained, practiced effort. It takes real work to deceive someone this completely. He worked at it. Lauren was quiet for a moment, then she said, Did you know he did this before today? I suspected the scale of it, Daniel said. I confirmed the specifics in the last 6 weeks. Why didn't you warn me? Because I needed to be in this courtroom to present it, he said. If you had known and he had found out you knew, he would have moved faster. He would have changed structures. He would have buried things deeper. I needed him comfortable. I needed him thinking he had already won. He paused. I'm sorry for that. I know it was a hard 6 weeks. Lauren thought about the last 6 weeks. The late nights with her folder. The phone calls that went unreturned. The morning she had sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes trying to make herself walk into the building. She thought about Nathan laughing when he walked in that morning. He was comfortable, she said. Yes, right up until you walked through the door, that was the point. Across the room, Gerald Fitch was finishing his conversation with Nathan. Nathan straightened. He ran a hand briefly across his jaw. He walked back to the table with the controlled movements of received nudes and chosen to keep walking anyway. He glanced at Lauren as he passed. This time she was the one who did not look back. Not because she was afraid to, because she simply was not interested. That was new. That was something she would think about later. In a quieter place, when she had room to understand what it meant, the moment she realized that Nathan Caldwell's eyes on her no longer pulled anything out of her. Not fear, not the old reflexive urge to read his mood and adjust herself accordingly. Not even anger, just nothing. Indifference had arrived so quietly she almost missed it. But she felt it, and it felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in years. The recess ended. Judge Harmon Daniels stood. Your Honor, the defense is prepared to present additional documentation regarding a pattern of behavior that goes beyond the financial transfers already discussed. Specifically, we would like to address the question of how Mrs. Whitmore came to have no professional contacts, no independent income, and no legal representation going into this hearing, and whether that situation arose naturally or was engineered. Nathan went very still. Gerald Fitch looked at his legal pad. Mr. Caldwell, Daniel continued, and here he looked directly at Nathan for the first time, with something other than professional neutrality. Something brief and precise and very clear was not only moving money. He was also making phone calls. Nathan's flat hand pressed harder against the table. And the courtroom, which had thought it had already heard the worst of it, understood that the worst of it had not arrived yet. Lauren sat with her hands in her lap. She did not know what was coming next. Daniel had not told her everything. He had told her enough to prepare her emotionally, but not so much that she would have had to carry it alone for the weeks before the hearing. He had made that choice for her, and she was just now understanding it, the care that had gone into every decision he made about how to bring her to this day. She breathed in out. She thought about the boy with the blue jacket, the broken zipper on the left pocket, the scar on her palm. She thought about him saying, I wasn't going to find you just to lose you again. She thought about walking into this building alone that morning, not knowing he was coming, not knowing anyone was coming, holding her worn folder because it was all she had. She was not holding it now. She didn't need it now. What she had now was real. What she had now was standing beside her with 22 years of experience and 6 weeks of preparation and whatever was in the next document he was about to place in front of the court. She was not afraid, she was ready. She had been ready since the moment she didn't sign those papers. She just hadn't known it until now. Daniel did not rush to the next document. He let the weight of what he had just said sit in the room for a moment. That Nathan had been making phone calls. That the situation Lauren found herself in on the morning of this hearing was not simply the result of circumstance. That someone had worked, deliberately and quietly, to make sure she arrived here alone. He reached into his stack and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He did not hold it dramatically. He simply placed it in front of him and looked at Judge Harmon. Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit 22. This is a communication log obtained through a formal records request to a staffing and professional placement agency based in Houston. The agency is called Bridgepoint Executive Search. In the spring of last year, this agency received a call from a number registered to Caldwell Development Group. The caller identified himself as a reference contact for Lauren Whitmore, who had applied for a position as a senior operations coordinator at a company called Hargrove Partners. He paused. The caller told Bridgepoint's recruiter that Mrs. Whitmore had a history of financial mismanagement in a previous role, that she had been asked to leave that role quietly to avoid formal proceedings, and that while the caller wished her well personally, he felt ethically obligated to disclose this information. The room absorbed this. Lauren's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. She remembered Hargrove Partners. She had applied there 14 months ago. She had made it through 2 rounds of interviews. She had prepared for those interviews with more care than she had prepared for almost anything. In recent memory, researching the company, practicing her answers, buying a new blazer because her old one had a small stain on the sleeve that she couldn't get out. She had been told after the 3rd round that the position had been filled internally. The recruiter had been kind about it, professionally warm. The kind of warmth that she understood now was the warmth of someone who felt sorry for you. She had not applied for another position after that. She had told herself it was because she needed to focus on the marriage, on trying to fix something that she was not yet willing to admit was not fixable. But the truth she had not allowed herself to examine too directly, was that the rejection had broken something. She had poured so much into those interviews. She had let herself want the job in a way she hadn't let herself want anything in years. And when it didn't come through, something in her had quietly decided that wanting things led to specific kinds of pain and that it was safer not to. Nathan had done that not with a dramatic gesture, not with a confrontation, with one phone call to a recruiter. 5 minutes of his time, and it had cost her more than she had known until this moment. Your Honor, Daniel continued, this was not an isolated incident. We have documented 4 separate instances over a 3-year period in which Mr. Caldwell either contacted or caused to be contacted individuals at organizations where Mrs. Whitmore had applied for or was being considered for employment. In each case, false or misleading information was provided. In each case, Mrs. Whitmore was not hired. Gerald Fitch was already standing. Objection, this is completely unsupported. There is no evidence that Mr. Caldwell personally, Exhibit 23, Daniel said, without raising his voice, is a phone record, showing 14 calls from Caldwell's personal cell phone to numbers associated with the 4 organizations in question. The calls are time-stamped. They correlate directly with the dates on which Mrs. Whitmore's applications were under active consideration at each organization. Gerald's mouth closed. He sat down slowly. Nathan was very still. Judge Harmon removed her reading glasses and set them deliberately on the bench. When she did that, Lauren would later learn from Daniel, it meant she was moving from routine administrative attention to something more focused. Something personal, Mr. Cross, the judge said. Are you representing to this court that the defendant engaged in a sustained campaign to prevent his wife from obtaining independent employment? I am, Your Honor, Daniel said, and I will demonstrate that this campaign was not incidental to the divorce proceedings. It began approximately 3 years before Mr. Caldwell filed for divorce. It was preparatory. It was designed to ensure that when the marriage ended, Mrs. Whitmore would have no professional standing, no independent income, and no ability to sustain a legal challenge to whatever settlement Caldwell chose to offer. He looked at Nathan directly. He wasn't just hiding money, Daniel said. He was engineering her helplessness. Nathan stood up. Not to address the judge, not through proper procedure. He simply stood the way people stand when something inside them has exceeded the container they are trying to keep it in. That is a lie, he said. His voice was flat and very controlled, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. I supported this woman for 8 years. I gave her everything. I gave her a home, access to everything I built, and she is standing in this court trying to take it from me with fabricated. Mr. Judge Harmon's voice was a blade. Sit down. Now Nathan sat. But the damage was done. Not the damage of someone who had said something incriminating, though the outburst itself was telling. The damage of a mask slipping. The damage of a man who had spent an entire morning performing composure, allowing the courtroom to see, for 3 seconds, what was underneath it. Gerald Fitch leaned toward him and said something sharp and low. Nathan turned his head away. Daniel waited a moment. Then he continued, Your Honor, I would like to move to the third area of evidence. This concerns the business contributions of Mrs. Whitmore and the specific ways in which those contributions were excluded from the official record. He produced a different document, thicker than the previous ones. This is a compilation of internal communications, contractor records, and third-party testimony from 7 individuals who worked directly with Mrs. Whitmore during her time in an operational role at Caldwell Development Group. I want to be clear about something the court should understand. Mrs. Whitmore never held a formal title at this company. She never received a salary. She was never listed on any organizational document as an employee or officer. According to the official record, she did not work there. She was simply the owner's wife. He let that phrase settle. The official record is wrong. He began presenting the compiled testimony. It was methodical and dense, and it built the way good evidence builds, not through drama, but through accumulation. 7 people who had worked with Lauren, some of whom had never met Nathan Caldwell in person, all describing the same woman. The woman who answered their calls when Nathan didn't. The woman who resolved the dispute over the Henderson Street project when the general contractor threatened to walk. The woman who caught the error in the Meridian Heights environmental permits that would have cost the company its variance approval. The woman who spent 4 months negotiating a subcontractor agreement that saved the company approximately $800,000 in labor costs on the West Chase project. 7 people, different contexts, different years, all describing the same person. None of their accounts had ever appeared anywhere in the official record of Caldwell Development Group. Because Nathan had never written it down, it occurred to Lauren, listening to Daniel present at this, that Nathan's failure to document her contributions had been just as deliberate as his decision to document his own. You build a record of what you want people to see. You allow the absence of a record to erase what you don't. She had never thought about it that way before. She had thought she was just helping. She had thought that was what marriage was. You helped the person you were with. And it didn't require a title or a salary or a line on a document, because the help was its own reward and the partnership was its own recognition. She understood now with the particular clarity of someone sitting in a courtroom listening to her contributions, people who actually saw them, that the absence of documentation had not been neutral. It had been a weapon held in reserve for exactly this moment. Gerald Fitch cross-examined the financial expert who had been involved in compiling the business contribution evidence. He was good at his job, and he landed some technical points about the difference between informal support and legally recognized contribution. He was measured, and he didn't overreach. He knew that the emotional momentum of the room had shifted, and he was trying to work on the edges rather than challenge the center. Daniel listened to all of it without visible reaction. When Gerald finished, Daniel stood for redirect. I have one follow-up question. And his voice had a quality that made the room pay attention before he had said anything of substance. In your review of the operational records you compiled, did you come across any instance in which Mr. Caldwell, in any internal communication, acknowledged Mrs. Whitmore's role in any of the projects we discussed? The expert looked at his notes. No, he said, I did not. Not once, over 8 years of business activity, in which Mrs. Whitmore's involvement is documented by 7 independent witnesses across multiple major projects. Mr. Caldwell never once in any internal communication acknowledged that she had contributed anything. That is correct. Daniel nodded slowly. No further questions. He sat down. Nathan was looking at the table in front of him. Not at Lauren, not at the judge, at the table. His right hand was flat against the surface. Gerald Fitch wrote something on his legal pad and slid it to Nathan. Nathan did not look at it. Judge Harmon called a lunch recess. The room began to move. Shifted, voices came back. The bailiff opened the main doors. Gerald Fitch gathered his documents with the careful efficiency of someone preparing to regroup. Nathan stood and walked toward the door without speaking to anyone, not even Gerald. He moved through the room the way a man moves when he is focused entirely on not letting his walk communicate what his face is trying to hide. He did not look at Lauren as he passed the table. Lauren watched him go. She noticed that his shoulders, which had been back and square all morning, the posture of a man who owned every room he walked into, were slightly less square now. Not dramatically, just slightly. The kind of shift you would only notice if you had watched those shoulders for 8 years and knew exactly what they looked like when they were carrying something heavier than he wanted anyone to see. She noticed it and she felt nothing about it. Not satisfaction. Not sympathy, just the quiet neutrality of observation without emotional investment. She was surprised by that. She had expected this day to feel like more. She had expected Nathan's discomfort to produce something in her vindication, perhaps or even guilt or some complicated mixture of both. Instead, she felt mostly tired and mostly clear, which was a combination she had not experienced in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. Tired and clear, that was what truth felt like, she decided, when it finally arrived after a very long wait. In a small conference room down the hall, Daniel spread his remaining documents across the table and walked Lauren through the afternoon session. He's going to try to reframe this, Daniel said. Gerald's is good. He'll find the most sympathetic angle he can. He'll probably get the context of the phone calls, try to argue that any reference calls were given in good faith, that Nathan genuinely believed what he was saying, that it doesn't constitute interference. Lauren looked at the document spread in front of her. Does that argument work? Not when you have 14 calls, Daniel said. 1 call is a reference, 14 calls is a pattern. What's next? After lunch? Daniel looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that she had been noticing since morning, a quality of careful preparation, as if he had been holding certain things back, pacing them, not because he was uncertain about them, but because he understood the difference between information and impact. There's one more piece, he said. Lauren waited. Nathan didn't just call employers, Daniel said. There's an audio recording. The room was quiet. What's on it? Lauren asked. Daniel looked at her with the specific attention of someone who wants to see your face before he changes it. His voice, Daniel said, talking to someone we believe it's a close associate, though the second voice was not clearly identified about you. About the plan, about what he expected to happen in this courtroom. Lauren was still. It was recorded approximately 7 months ago, Daniel said. We obtained it legally. The person who made the recording came to us voluntarily. Who? Daniel shook his head slightly. I'll tell you after the hearing. Right now what matters is what's on it. Tell me what's on it. He did. He told her the relevant portions, not all of it, just enough. And Lauren sat in that conference room and listened and did not say anything until he had finished. And then she sat quietly for another moment, looking at the wall across from her, and she thought about the evening she could place it now. Approximately 7 months ago, when Nathan had come home from what he described as a dinner meeting with a client. He had been relaxed that evening, unusually relaxed. He had poured himself a drink, sat in the living room, and watched the news for an hour, and she had noticed the relaxation in him the way you notice any unusual weather. She had thought, with the cautious optimism that never fully died in her, even when it probably should have, that maybe something had resolved for him, that maybe he was in a better place, that maybe things were turning towards something better. He had been relaxed because he had been planning. He had been relaxed the way people are relaxed when they believe they have secured an outcome. Okay, Lauren said. Her voice was steady. She had decided that morning that she was going to steady, and she had kept that decision through everything, and she was going to keep it through this. Are you all right? Daniel asked. She looked at him. Her older brother, the boy in the blue jacket. The man who had spent 14 months building file and six weeks preparing for him, watching come from a distance to sure she was safe, come before he walked through a door. I'm better than all right, she said. Let's go back in. The afternoon session began with Gerald Fitch doing exactly what Daniel had predicted. He worked the edges. He challenged the context of the phone calls. He presented Nathan's perspective on the financial transfers, a business decision made in good faith, based on advice from a financial consultant, which the consultant would testify to. He was careful and professional, and he made the best argument available to him, which was not a very good argument but was executed with real skill. Then Daniel asked the court's permission to play the audio recording. Gerald objected on 5 separate grounds. Judge Harmon overruled all 5. Daniel set a small device on the table. The room became absolutely still. Nathan's hands were no longer on the table. He had moved them to his lap, which Lauren recognized as the other version of his anchor gesture when pressing flat wasn't enough, when he needed to hide the hands entirely. The recording played. Nathan's voice filled the courtroom. It was not the polished, managed voice he had been using all morning. It was his actual voice, the one Lauren knew from home, the one he used when he thought no one outside his chosen circle was listening. Relaxed, certain, almost amused. "She thinks it's about the money," Nathan's voice said. "She doesn't understand what I actually built here. She thinks she helped. She answered some emails. She talked to some contractors. That's not building something, that's being in the vicinity of something being built." A pause. The sound of ice in a glass. "She'll fold in court," Nathan's voice continued. "She doesn't have anyone. She never built anything of her own. That was always the issue. She leaned. That's what she did. She leaned on me and I let her because it was useful for a while. And now it's not useful anymore and she has nowhere to lean. And she is going to walk into that courtroom and realize that everything she thought she was is just a reflection of me." Another pause. "She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She always did." The recording ended. The silence that followed was not like the other silences in the courtroom that day. It was not the silence of surprise or the silence of attention or even the silence of collective discomfort. It was the silence of a room full of people who have just witnessed something that they cannot look away from and cannot entirely bear to look at. The particular silence of witnessing. Judge Harmon sat with her hands folded on the bench. She did not speak immediately. Lauren looked straight forward. She did not cry. She had promised herself, and she kept the promise, though it cost her more in this moment than it had cost her at any point in the day. Because the recording had done something she had not fully anticipated. She had known, intellectually, that Nathan didn't respect her. She had understood it through years of evidence, but hearing his voice describe her, hearing the word reflection, hearing the casual, comfortable certainty with which he had decided who she was and what she was worth, that was something that went past the intellectual understanding and landed somewhere much older and much rawer. She was not a reflection. She had never been a reflection. But she understood, sitting in that courtroom, how long she had spent in a marriage with someone who was actively constructing that reality for her, and how much of it, in the quiet of her most honest self, she had started to believe. Daniel placed his hand briefly on the table near hers. Not touching, just present. A specific kind of presence that said, "I am here and I see you and you are not what he said." She breathed. She straightened. Nathan was looking at the floor. Not at the judge, not at Gerald Fitch, not at Lauren. At the floor, the precise rectangle of floor in front of his chair, as if the answer to something was down there. Gerald Fitch said, in a voice that had lost some of its professional smoothness, "Your Honor, we would request a brief recess to confer with our client." Judge Harmon looked at Nathan for a long moment. Then she said, "We'll take 15 minutes." The room exhaled. During the recess, Nathan and Gerald disappeared into a side hallway. Lauren could see them through the small window in the door, Nathan with his back against the wall, Gerald standing in front of him, speaking with the earnest urgency of an attorney who is recalculating in real time. Nathan's arms were crossed, his head was down. He was listening in the way people listen, when they don't want to hear what is being said, but understand that they no longer have the option of not hearing it. Daniel sat beside Lauren and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You did well in there." "I didn't do anything," Lauren said. "You did everything. You sat in that room and listened to the worst of it without breaking," Daniel said. "That's not nothing. That's one of the hardest things a person can do." Lauren looked at her hands. "The reflection thing," she said quietly. Daniel was quiet. "He actually believed that," she said. You could hear it in his voice. He wasn't performing for someone. He was saying what he actually thought. She paused. "How do you spend 8 years with someone and not know that they see you that way?" "Because he didn't let you see it," Daniel said. "People like Nathan don't show you the frame they put you in. They just keep you inside it." Lauren thought about that. She thought about the kitchen table where he had drawn the diagram to explain the account restructuring. She thought about the way he had looked at her while he explained it, patient, clear, helpful. She thought about thanking him for explaining it. She thought about how natural it had felt to thank him for explaining something that had turned out to be a lie. "He was very good at this," she said. It was the thing Daniel had said to her earlier, and she was saying it now from a different place, not repeating it, but arriving at it herself from the inside. "Yes," Daniel said. "But I'm still here," Lauren said. Daniel looked at her. "I'm still here," she said again, not loudly, not with the energy of someone performing strength for an audience. Quietly, with the weight of someone who has just said something true that they have needed to say for a long time and have finally found the language for. Daniel said, "Yes, you are." When Nathan and Gerald returned to the courtroom, something had changed in the posture of both men. Gerald's was the change of an attorney who has revised his strategy. Nathan's was something more complicated. He sat down without looking at anyone. He placed both hands flat on the table, which was the gesture Lauren had spent the whole morning reading, but this time it looked less like anchoring and more like steadying. Like a man who needs to hold on to something because the floor is less reliable than it was this morning. Judge Harmon called the room to order. Daniel stood. Your Honor, at this point, I would like to present what I believe is the most significant piece of evidence in this case. Not the financial transfers, not the employment interference, and not the recording, though all of those are substantial. What I want to present now is the full picture of what Caldwell Development Group actually is, as opposed to what Mr. Caldwell has represented it to be. Because the question of what my client is entitled to depends entirely on the question of what was actually built here and who built it. He picked up the thickest document in his stack. I have here an independent operational analysis of Caldwell Development Group conducted by a firm called Meridian Advisory. Based in Dallas, they were retained by my office 6 weeks ago. They reviewed 7 years of the company's operational history. Their conclusion is that during the period of Mrs. Whitmore's involvement, the company's close rate on major projects over $5 million was 63% higher than in the years preceding her involvement. He set the document down, 63%, Your Honor. That is not the contribution of someone who was in the vicinity of something being built. That is the contribution of someone who was essential to how it was built. Nathan's head came up. For the first time in nearly an hour, he looked directly at Daniel. And Daniel looked back. And something passed between them, the two men who were on opposite sides of everything in this room that was neither legal nor professional. It was older than that, more fundamental. It was the specific look of a man who has been exposed completely, documentably, in a room full of witnesses looking at the person who exposed him. Daniel held the look without flinching. Nathan looked away first. Gerald Fitch was writing rapidly. Judge Harmon was reading the Meridian Advisory document that the clerk had just handed her. The courtroom was absolutely still. Lauren looked at the number Daniel had just spoken. 63%. She turned it over, in her mind the way you turn over something you have found, after a long search carefully, from different angles, making sure it is real. She thought about the Henderson Street project, the contractor dispute she had spent 3 weeks navigating, calling and recalling, finding the language that allowed both sides to feel they had preserved something. She had not told Nathan the full detail of how hard that had been, because by then she had already learned that telling Nathan the full detail of her difficulty produced a particular response that made her feel smaller, that made the difficulty feel like evidence of inadequacy rather than evidence of work. So she had solved it and said simply that it was resolved and let him receive the resolution without the cost. 63%, 7-year invisible. Until today, she felt Daniel's evidence landing in the room around her like something physical, like something that was altering the actual space of the place. The judge's expression, the clerk's stillness, the quality of attention from the people in the back of the room who had come for other cases and found themselves unable to leave. Nathan had walked into this courtroom this morning believing he had engineered a perfect outcome. He had moved the money. He had isolated Lauren professionally. He had frozen the accounts. He had waited until the hearing was close enough that any legal aid intervention would be too slow. He had prepared his attorney and his financials expert and his settlement documents, and he had walked in wearing the charcoal suit she had picked out for him, and he had laughed when he looked at the empty chair beside her. He had thought of almost everything. He had not thought of the door. He had not thought about who knew about that door and how long they had been waiting on the other side of it. Judge Harmon set down the Meridian Advisory document. She looked out at the courtroom. Then she did something that the bailiff, who had worked in this courthouse for 11 years, would later describe to a colleague as something he had never quite seen Judge Harmon do before. She looked directly at Nathan Caldwell and she said, with the quiet, unambiguous weight of someone who has made up their mind about something important, Mr. Caldwell, I want you to understand what this court has heard today. Nathan met her eyes. We have heard that you moved over $6 million out of the marital estate in the 18 months before filing for divorce. We have heard that you made 14 calls to organizations where your wife was seeking employment, and that those calls were followed in every instance by her application failing. We have heard a recording in which you described your wife as someone with nowhere to lean and no identity of her own. And we have now heard an independent analysis establishing that her operational contributions to your company were directly associated with a 63% improvement in your major project outcomes. She paused. "This is no longer a routine asset division hearing," she said. "And I want your counsel to understand that clearly going into this afternoon's final session." Gerald Fitch said, "Your Honor, we understand." Nathan said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes forward and his shoulders at an angle that was no longer the angle of a man who owned the room. Lauren sat beside her brother. She was tired. She was more tired than she could remember being in a long time. The deep, specific tiredness of a person who has been in a room with the truth for several hours and has had to hold herself steady through all of it. But underneath the tiredness, something else was moving. Something that had been buried for a long time. Something that had survived. Somehow, everything that had been done to cover it. She could feel it. She did not have a name for it yet. But it was there, and it was hers, and no settlement document, no LLC structure, no phone call to a recruiter, no recording of a man explaining why she was nothing. None of it had managed to reach far enough down to get to it. It had been there the whole time. She had just needed this room, and this day, and the man beside her to remember where it was. Judge Harmon called the final afternoon session to order at 2:17 in the afternoon. The courtroom had a different quality now than it had at 9 in the morning. The people who had come for other cases and stayed were still there. The clerk moved more carefully. The bailiff stood with a different kind of attention. Even the light through the windows seemed to have changed, not dramatically, not in any way that could be described precisely, but in the way that all environments shift when something significant has through them and left a mark. Gerald Fitch opened the afternoon by requesting that certain pieces of Daniel's evidence be stricken from the record on technical grounds. He was thorough and he was professional, and he argued 3 separate motions with the focused competence of a man who understood he was no longer fighting for victory but for the best available version of damage control. Judge Harmon denied all 3 motions. She did it without lengthy deliberation. She had read the documents during the lunch recess, and her decisions had clearly been made before she sat back down. Nathan sat through the motion denials without visible reaction. Lauren watched him from across the room and saw something she had not expected to see, not anger, not calculation, but a kind of settled flatness. The expression of a man who has moved through the stages of a difficult reality and arrived at the stage where he simply has to sit inside it. She had seen that expression on other people's faces at different points in her life. She had never thought she would see it on Nathan's. Gerald turned to his remaining arguments. He was trying to minimize. He was trying to reframe the financial transfers as legitimate business decisions, the phone calls as misguided but not malicious, the recording as the private frustration of a man going through a painful divorce rather than evidence of a deliberate strategy. He was doing the best he could with what he had, which was considerably less than he had walked in with that morning. Daniel let him finish. Then Daniel stood and did something that surprised the room, because the room had been prepared for more documents, more evidence, more methodical excavation of the record. Instead, Daniel placed his hands on the table and spoke directly to Judge Harmon without looking at a single piece of paper. "Your Honor," he said, "I want to take a moment away from the documents and speak plainly. Because I think the documents have said most of what needs to be said, and what remains is something simpler." Judge Harmon nodded slightly. "My client walked into this building this morning, carrying a folder she had put together herself, alone at her kitchen table over several months. She had no attorney. She had no financial resources that hadn't been frozen or manipulated. She had been told repeatedly and in multiple ways that she had nothing and deserved nothing, and would leave this marriage with exactly what she was offered, because that was all she was entitled to." He paused. "She walked in anyway." The room was quiet. "I want this court to understand something about Lauren Whitmore that 8 years of marriage to Nathan Caldwell was specifically designed to obscure. She is not a woman who was carried through this marriage. She is not a woman who leaned, to use her husband's word. She is a woman who held things together, a business, a household, a set of professional relationships without recognition, without compensation, without documentation, and without complaint. She did it because she believed in the partnership. She did it because that is who she is. And when the partnership ended and she found herself in this courtroom, she came here and she held herself steady through one of the most difficult days a person can have. And she did not break." He looked at Lauren for a moment. Lauren kept her eyes on the bench. "That is who this court is deciding the future of today," Daniel said. "Not the woman Mr. Caldwell described in that recording. The woman who walked through that door this morning." He's down. Nathan's jaw moved. Gerald Fitch chose not to respond to that directly. which was probably the right professional decision and cost him something personally, because every attorney in every courtroom wants to respond when the other side has just done something that moved the room. Judge Harmon looked down at her notes. She looked up. She looked at Nathan's table and then at Lauren's table, and then at a middle distance that was neither, the particular gaze of someone organizing a decision. "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess," she said. "When we return, I will issue my preliminary findings and direct the parties on next steps." The room began to move. Nathan stood abruptly. He walked toward the door without waiting for Gerald. Gerald gathered his papers quickly and followed. And Lauren could see from the angle of Gerald's movement that he was working to catch up physically and strategically. The two things collapsed into one urgent trajectory. Lauren stayed at the table. Daniel sat beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was a comfortable quality to the sequence between them, which was remarkable given that they had been strangers to each other in all practical terms for 41 years. But some silences are not built from familiarity. Some silences are built from the recognition that the people listening with understand the weight of what just happened without needing to discuss it. That was the silence between them now. After a minute, Lauren said, "What did you mean when you said you needed to be sure I was safe before you made contact?" Daniel had been expecting this question. He had been expecting it since this morning. "I found you 2 years ago," he said, "through a property records search initially. Then I hired someone to verify. When I confirmed you were living in the house on Breer Grove, I started watching, not intrusively, just enough to understand the situation." Lauren absorbed this. "And what did you see?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Enough," he said. "Enough to know I wasn't safe. Enough to know you were in something that had its own gravity," he said. "Something that would be very difficult to leave from the outside. I needed to understand it before I approached you. Because if I had approached you and Nathan had found out, I needed to be in a position where I could protect you when that happened." Lauren looked at her hands. "How long did it take you to find me?" she said. "After everything." Daniel's expression changed. Not dramatically, just the shift that crosses a person's face when a question touches something old and unresolved. "I started looking when I was 24, he said. "I was in law school. I had resources for the first time. I had learned to use systems that I didn't know how to use before." He paused. "It took me a long time because your name had changed. Multiple times. The records from that period were fragmented." Lauren knew what he was referring to without him describing it. The years after the separation, the years of moving. The different names that came with different placements, different guardians, different attempts by different adults to give her a stable situation. She had not thought about those years in a long time. She kept them in a specific compartment, sealed, not because she was ashamed of them, but because opening them cost more than she usually had available to spend. "You never stopped," she said. "I stopped once," he said. "For about 8 months when I was 32. I had been looking for 8 years, and I let myself believe that if I hadn't found you in 8 years, the search itself might be causing more damage than the not knowing." He paused. "Then I picked it back up." "What made you pick it back up?" "A client," he said. He looked slightly away. "I had a client family law case, completely unrelated, who was looking for a sibling she had lost. The circumstances were different from ours, but watching that case, watching her refuse to stop looking, I went home that night and I picked it back up." Lauren pressed her lips together. She thought about the 8 months when he had stopped. She thought about what she had been doing during those 8 months. She didn't know exactly when they were, what years they corresponded to. But she thought about the general texture of her 30s, the searching, the settling, the gradual accumulation of a life that was mostly hers but had a specific hollow in it that she had learned to navigate around. She had become very good at navigating around the hollow. She had become so good that sometimes she forgot it was there. She looked at Daniel. "I'm glad you picked it back up," she said. His throat moved. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They sat with that for a moment. Then Daniel looked at his watch and said, "She'll be back in 12 minutes. Are you ready?" Lauren thought about the question. She thought about ready, what it meant, what it required. She thought about the morning, the parking garage, the 11 minutes, the worn folder pressed against her chest. She thought about walking through the door alone. She thought about Nathan laughing. She thought about the papers scattered across the floor and getting on her knees to collect them. And she thought about how she had gotten back up without saying anything and sat back down and waited. She thought about the recording, Nathan's voice, relaxed and certain and thoroughly wrong about every single thing he said. She thought that about a 63% improvement, 7 witnesses and 14 phone calls, and $6 million that she had not known existed, until Daniel laid it out in a room full of strangers. Yes, she said, when Judge Harmon returned and called the room to order, the first thing she did was look at Nathan Caldwell. Nathan was seated. Gerald Fitch was beside him. Nathan's hands were folded on the table now, not flat, not pressing, folded. Lauren had not seen him fold his hands in years. It was a gesture from early in their marriage. From the person he had been before the business grew large enough to give him the kind of confidence that doesn't need to manage itself. Judge Harmon said, "I have reviewed the evidence presented today by both parties. I want to share my preliminary findings and the directions I intend to give as this case moves toward final disposition." She picked up a document. Regarding the financial transfers, this court finds that the movement of assets from marital to accounts and marital adjacent accounts set to separate business entities during the 18 months preceding the divorce filing constitutes a prima facie case of dissipation of marital assets. The total documented transfer of $6,240,000 will be treated by this court as part of the marital estate subject to equitable distribution. Furthermore, I am directing a forensic accounting review of all Caldwell Development Group entities and affiliated LLCs for the purpose of identifying any additional transfers not yet documented. Gerald Fitch was writing rapidly. Nathan's folded hands tightened. Regarding the employment interference, this court finds that the documented pattern of phone calls made to organizations where Mrs. Whitmore sought employment, coupled with the correlation between those calls and the failure of her applications, warrants further investigation. I am referring this matter to the court's Family Law Investigative Unit. Depending on the findings of that investigation, additional remedies may be available to Mrs. Whitmore beyond the scope of this divorce proceeding. The room was very still. Nathan turned to Gerald. Gerald put his hand briefly on Nathan's arm, the same restraining gesture from this morning, and Nathan, who had pulled away from it then, did not pull away now. Regarding the proposed settlement, Judge Harmon continued, I am rejecting Mr. Caldwell's submitted settlement proposal in its entirety. It does not reflect an equitable division of marital assets as established by the evidence presented today. The parties will return to negotiation with a revised framework that accounts for the documented contributions of Mrs. Whitmore to the marital estate, including her operational contributions to Caldwell Development Group as established by independent analysis, the dissipated assets identified through financial review, and any additional assets identified through the forensic accounting process I have ordered. She set down the document. She looked at Nathan. Mr. Caldwell, she said, this court takes a serious view of what has been presented here today. I want to be direct with you. The evidence suggests a pattern of behavior that goes considerably beyond ordinary divorce proceedings. The financial transfers, the employment interferences, the recording taken together, these paint a picture of deliberate and sustained effort to undermine your wife's position before this court. I want you to understand that this court sees that picture clearly. Nathan sat completely still. I expect your full cooperation with the forensic accounting process, Judge Harmon said. I expect complete financial disclosure going forward. And I expect that you understand the serious consequences of any further attempt to conceal, transfer, or otherwise manipulate any asset that may be subject to this court's jurisdiction. Gerald Fitch said, Your Honor, my client understands. We will cooperate fully. Judge Harmon looked at him. Make sure he does, she said. It was the most personal thing she had said all day. It landed in the room like something heavy, and it did not bounce. Nathan did not speak. What happened to Nathan's face in that moment was something Lauren had never seen before, and she had watched his eyes for 8 years through every emotional register he possessed. This was something different, something underneath the registers. Something that came from a place in him that did not usually surface. He looked for just a moment exactly like a man who has been seen. Not the version of himself he presented. Not the confident developer in the charcoal suit who laughed in courtrooms and made phone calls to recruiters and drew diagrams at kitchen tables to explain lies. The actual man underneath all of that. The man who had spent years constructing elaborate systems to ensure a specific outcome and was now sitting in a room where every one of those systems had been taken apart in front of witnesses. Lauren looked at him. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something closer to triumph, or at least relief, but what she actually felt was more complicated and more quiet. She felt the way you feel when a thing you have been carrying for a very long time is finally set down, not exhilarated, not elated, but something in the region of permission. Permission to breathe at a different depth. Permission to stop managing the weight. She looked away from Nathan. She did not need to watch him anymore. The hearing concluded. Judge Harmon issued her formal orders. The forensic accounting firm would be appointed by the court within 30 days. A return hearing was scheduled for 60 days out. The proposed settlement was officially withdrawn from consideration. Gerald Fitch gathered his materials with the thorough efficiency of a man who has already begun restructuring his strategy for the next phase. He was professional to the end. That was his nature and his training, and Lauren respected it, even as she understood that his professionalism had been deployed entirely in service of what Nathan wanted to do to her. Nathan stood when the room stood. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up the glass of water in front of him and drank from it, which was such a normal, ordinary gesture that it was almost startling. He put the glass down. He turned toward the door. He stopped. He turned back. He was looking at Lauren. This was unexpected. Lauren had not anticipated that he would speak to her directly. The proceedings were over. The attorneys were the ones who communicated now. That was how these things worked. She had thought they were past the moment where Nathan would look at her in any way that required a response. But he was looking at her, and his expression was not any of the things she had prepared for. It was not anger. It was not the residual contempt of someone who has lost a battle but is not finished with the war. It was something she had not seen on Nathan's face in so long that she almost didn't recognize it. Something close to grief. She did not move, Lauren, he said. Gerald Fitch put a hand on Nathan's arm. Nathan, not now. Nathan looked at Gerald. Something passed between them. Then Nathan looked back at Lauren and he said, very quietly, I didn't think you had anyone. The words landed in the room. Lauren looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the calm of someone who has finally located the truth of something and found that it is not as complicated as they feared. I know. Nathan looked at her a moment longer. Then he turned and walked out. Gerald followed. The room began to empty. Daniel was beside her, gathering documents, the quiet efficiency of someone moving to the next thing. But he paused. He looked at her. What did that mean? He asked. What you said to him. Lauren thought about it for a moment. It means I know that he believed it, she said. He genuinely believed I had no one. He wasn't just saying it to be cruel. He actually thought it was true. She paused. And for a long time he was right. Daniel was quiet. But here's what I've been thinking about, Lauren said. He spent 8 years making sure I had no one. He made those phone calls. He moved that money. He drew those diagrams. He put enormous effort into making sure I was isolated. She looked at Daniel. Why would you spend that much energy isolating someone you believed was powerless? Daniel looked at her. Because he knew I wasn't, she said. Somewhere underneath all of it, he knew exactly what I was capable of, and that frightened him. So he spent 8 years trying to make sure I never found out. The silence between them was different from the silence they had shared that day. It was the silence of something understood, something settled. Something that had traveled a very long distance to arrive at this particular moment, in this particular room. Daniel put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, firmly. The way people touch each other when words have reached their limit. Let's get out of here, he said. They walked out of the courtroom together. Through the hallway, past the clerk's windows and the waiting area where other people sat with their own folders and their own worn edges. Through the lobby with its floors that echoed every footstep. Through the main doors and into the air outside, which after hours of recirculated courthouse air felt like something you could be grateful for. They stood on the steps. Lauren looked at the city around her. Houston in the afternoon, the particular quality of Texas light at this hour, warm and direct and indifferent to human drama in the most comforting possible way. She breathed. What happens now, she said. Now we wait for the forensic accounting, Daniel said. Based on what I've already found, I expect the review to turn up additional assets. The 3 entities I couldn't fully trace, I think at least one of them is substantial. He paused. The employment interference referral is significant too. That may open a separate avenue of remedy that goes beyond the divorce settlement. Lauren nodded slowly. That's not actually what I meant, she said. Daniel looked at her. I meant, what do I do now, today, this evening? She paused. I've spent so long just trying to survive this that I don't know what the next thing looks like when the surviving is mostly done. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said, but I'd like to help figure it out. Lauren looked at him. She thought about the boy in the blue jacket, the broken zipper. The scar on her hand, the 41 years that had passed like a country she had crossed alone without a map. She thought about him looking for her for 22 years, stopping once for 8 months, then picking it back up because a client refused to stop looking. She thought about 14 months of files and 6 weeks of preparation, and a flight from Austin that arrived late, and a notice of appearance filed at 7:48 in the morning. She thought about the door opening, the footsteps that were measured and unhurried and completely certain. The moment she had looked up from her notes and seen a face she had carried in her body for 41 years without being able to see it. She thought about, hey, just that, just hey, too quiet for anyone else to hear. She put her hand in her blazer pocket. She carried things in her pockets, small things, tactile things, things her hands could find in moments when she needed something real to hold. In her right pocket was a small, smooth stone she had picked up at a park years ago. In her left pocket was a pen she particularly liked. And underneath the pen, in the corner of the pocket, was the small scar from a zipper pull she had gotten when she was 10 years old. She touched it. Okay, she said to Daniel. He nodded. They stood on the steps for another moment in the late afternoon light, and then they began to walk, side by side, down toward the street, away from the courthouse, away from the worn folder and the water stains and the sound of Nathan laughing in a room where he thought he had already won. Behind them, somewhere in the building they had just left, a forensic accounting process was about to begin. Somewhere, an investigative unit was opening a file with Nathan Caldwell's name on it. Somewhere, $6,240,000 was being reclassified as belonging, in whole or in part, to the woman who was currently walking down a courthouse steps in a navy blue blazer, with a small stone in one pocket and a pen in the other. Nathan had spent years ensuring that Lauren arrived at this day with nothing. He had not accounted for the possibility that nothing, when you carry it long enough, when you refuse to put it down, when you walk through the door with it, pressed to your chest, even when your knees want to buckle, nothing has a way of becoming something. It does not happen dramatically. It does not happen in a single moment. It happens in small increments over a long time, and then all at once it happens in a courtroom, in the space of a morning, and the world after it is simply and permanently different from the world before it. Lauren had gone into that building one person. She was coming out another. Not a different person, the same person, but something had been restored to her that she had not known was missing until she felt it return. Her own outline, the shape of herself distinct and solid and entirely hers, no longer defined by what Nathan had decided she was, no longer confined to the frame he had built around her, no longer made of his version of her story, just Lauren, just exactly who she had always been, walking in the direction of everything that came next. Daniel matched her pace without trying. They did not speak for the first half block. Then Lauren said, "You know what I want to do right now?" "What? I want to get coffee," she said. "Real coffee, not courthouse coffee, and I want to sit somewhere and not think about any of this for 1 hour." Daniel looked at her. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh, not polished, not professional, not the controlled expression of someone managing a room. It was the laugh of a person who has been holding themselves together for a very long time and has found, unexpectedly, a moment where they don't have to. "I know a place," he said. "Good," Lauren said. And they kept walking. The coffee shop Daniel took her to was 3 blocks from the courthouse, which meant that for the first 10 minutes they sat there, Lauren kept expecting to see Gerald Fitch walk through the door or hear Nathan's voice somewhere behind her. Old habits, 8 years of monitoring for his presence, reading the atmosphere of every room for signs of his mood, had built a kind of permanent alertness in her body that did not know the hearing was over. That the decision had been made, that she was allowed to sit in a chair and drink coffee without calculating anything. She ordered a dark roast. Daniel ordered the same. They sat across from each other at a small table, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything particularly important. Daniel told her the coffee was good. She agreed. He mentioned that Houston traffic was worse than he remembered from the last time he had a case here. She told him it had gotten considerably worse in the last 3 years. They talked about traffic like two people who needed to talk about something ordinary before they could talk about anything real. Then the ordinary ran out. Lauren set down her cup. "Tell me about your life," she said. "I don't know anything about your life." Daniel looked at her. There was something in his expression that she was still learning to read the expressions of a man she had known intimately as a child and was meeting for the first time as an adult. The two things existed simultaneously and neither one canceled the other. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything," she said. "Start anywhere." So he did. He told her about law school at UT Austin, which he had gotten into on his second application after working for 2 years as a paralegal to save money. He told her about his first job at a firm in San Antonio that handled mostly insurance litigation, and how he had learned more about human nature in 3 years of insurance cases than in 3 years of law school. He told her about moving to Austin and building a practice over 15 years, slowly client by client, reputation by reputation, until he had the kind of standing that allowed him to take the cases he chose rather than the cases he needed. He told her he had been married once briefly in his early 30s. He said it was not a bad marriage, but it was not a right one, and they had both understood that within 2 years and parted without cruelty. He said he did not have children, which he had made peace with. Mostly, he said he had a house outside Austin with a back porch he used more than any other part of the house and a dog named Russell, who had opinions about everything. Lauren laughed at the dog. It was the first real laugh she had produced all day, and it surprised her, the sound of it. How easy it was, how it arrived without effort. "Tell me about searching for me," she said. When the laugh settled, the actual searching, what that was like. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "The first years were the hardest," he said. "Not because I wasn't finding you, though. I wasn't, but because I didn't know how to do it. I was using the wrong tools. I was thinking about it the wrong way. I kept looking for your name, and your name had changed, and I didn't know that yet. I spent 2 years looking for a Lauren Cross who didn't exist in any record I could access." Lauren was quiet. Cross had been their family name, the name she had before everything changed. "When did you figure out the name had changed?" "When I was 28, he said. "I hired a private investigator, the first one I could afford, who was actually good. She found the first record change within 3 months." He paused. "That was the first time I felt like I was actually looking in the right direction. And then it was still 10 years, he said. The records from those years, from when we were separated, they're fragmented in ways that are hard to describe. Different counties, different systems. Some things that should have been documented weren't. Some things were documented incorrectly." He looked at her. "You moved a lot, I moved a lot," Lauren confirmed. 14 times, Daniel said, "between when you were 10 and when you were 22. I counted eventually. When I finally had enough of the record to count, Lauren had not known the number. She had lived each move individually as its own disruption, its own new geography to learn. She had never counted them. Hearing the number from the outside from someone who had assembled them one by one through records, requests, and investigator reports made them into something different. Not just things that had happened to her, but evidence of something. A documented pattern of survival, 14 moves. She had survived 14 moves and eventually stopped moving. She thought about what it had cost her each time to stop moving and try to believe that the new place was real. To try to believe that this time was different. That this time she could put something down without picking it up again before she had learned to love it. She had done it imperfectly and she had kept doing it. That was something. "I need to tell you something," Daniel said. His voice changed slightly, just enough. Lauren looked at him. "About the 2 years before I contacted you," he said. "When I said I was watching to make sure you were safe, that's true. But it's not the complete truth." She waited. "I was also afraid," he said, "of reaching out, of what it would mean if I reached out and you didn't want contact. If you had made a life and I was a disruption to it, rather than something you needed." He looked at his cup. "I had spent 20 years looking for you, and I was afraid to find out that finding you wasn't the ending I thought it was." Lauren absorbed this. She thought about what she would have done if he had called her 2 years ago. Before the divorce proceedings accelerated. Before the frozen account and the settlement papers, and the morning she had found herself in a parking garage, trying to make herself get out of the car. She thought about who she had been 2 years ago, still inside the marriage. Still navigating, still telling herself the story that it was fixable. That she was overreacting, that the atmosphere of control she lived in was something she had at least partially created through her own inadequacy. Would she have been ready 2 years ago? She was honest with herself. "I don't know if I could have heard you then," she said. Daniel looked up. I was still inside his version of me," she said. 2 years ago, I might have answered your call and been so afraid of what Nathan would do if he found out that I would have told you it wasn't a good time. I might have sent you away without knowing what I was sending away." Daniel was quiet. "So the timing," Lauren said carefully, "maybe wasn't only about protecting me." "No," Daniel said. "It wasn't only about that. Maybe it was also the universe making sure I was ready." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that crossed the line between composed and something more unguarded. "Maybe," he said. They sat with that. Outside, Houston continued its afternoon. People walked past with their own urgencies and their own carried weights. A delivery person moved quickly. A woman spoke on her phone. The city went on the way cities go on, without regard for the specific scale of what had happened in the building 3 blocks away, which was as it should be. The world's indifference to personal seismic events was not cruelty but proportion. It reminded you that your disaster and your rescue existed in a larger context that would outlast both. Lauren found this comforting. She had always found the city's indifference comforting, though she had never had language for why until this moment. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down. She straightened in her chair with the unconscious adjustment of someone who has just made a decision. "I want to go to the house," she said. Daniel looked at her. "Nathan's house," she clarified. "My house. The house that is currently in both our names and that I have been living in for 6 years and have not been able to think of as mine, because he made it feel like I was a guest in it." She paused. "I want to go there and I want to walk through it and I want to decide what I'm keeping and what I'm not." Daniel nodded slowly. "Are you sure you're ready for that today?" "I'm sure I'm ready for that today specifically," she said. "Because if I wait, I'll talk myself out of it. And I've spent 8 years talking myself out of things. I'm done doing that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up both cups and walked them to the counter. "Let's go," he said. The house on Breer Grove was exactly as Lauren had left it that morning. The kitchen counter was clean because she had wiped it before she left, out of the old habit of leaving things orderly in case Nathan came home before she did. The living room had the particular stillness of a space no one had been in all day. The afternoon light came through the windows and fell across the floors and the furniture and all the objects that had accumulated over 6 years of a marriage. Lauren stood in the entry hall. She had stood in this entry hall thousands of times. She had stood here when she came home from grocery runs, and after the dinners Nathan took her to, and after long days and ordinary days, and days she could not remember anymore because they had dissolved into the general texture of the years. She had stood here and taken off her coat and her shoes and become, in the transition from outside to inside, the version of herself that Nathan's house required. She looked at the entry hall now and it looked different. Not because anything had changed about the physical space. Everything was exactly where she had left it. The console table. The mirror above it, the small bowl she kept her keys in. All of it identical to this morning. But she was looking at it from the outside of something she had been inside for 6 years, and that changed everything about how it appeared. She walked through the living room. She ran her hand along the back of the sofa. She stopped at the bookshelf and looked at the books, her books on the left side, Nathan's on the right, an arrangement that had established itself organically in the first year and never changed. She pulled one of her books out, looked at it, put it back. Daniel stood near the door and said nothing. He understood what she was doing, and he understood that the thing she was doing required quiet. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the drawer, where she kept the notebook, the small one, with the handwritten dates and events that she had compiled over 2 years and brought to court that morning in the worn folder. She took it out. She looked at it. 3 years ago she had begun this notebook because she needed to believe that she was not losing her mind. Because Nathan had a way of revising history that was so smooth and so practiced that she had begun to doubt her own recollection of events. She had started writing things down as a way of confirming that what she experienced was real. That the things that happened had actually happened. She held the notebook. This small spiral-bound notebook was the first resistance she had offered. The first act, however private and unobserved, of refusing to accept his version of reality over her own. She had kept it hidden inside a winter coat for 2 years. She had added to it carefully in small increments, like someone building something in secret, because they know the thing they are building will be destroyed if it is discovered too soon. She put the notebook in her bag. She kept moving through the house. She went upstairs. She stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment. She did not go inside. She looked at the room that had been her room for 6 years, the bed they had shared, the nightstand where she kept her book and her reading glasses, and the small lamp she had bought herself 3 years into the marriage because she needed a light she could turn off without disturbing him. She looked at all of it. Then she turned and walked to the small room at the end of the hall that Nathan had always called the storage room, and that she had gradually, over the years, made into something else. She had put a chair in there. A good lamp, a small table with her sewing on it and her books and the things she was reading, and the plants she grew in a window box and talked to in the mornings when the house was quiet. Nathan had never come into this room. He found small essays uninteresting. He found domestic detail uninteresting. He was a man of grand gestures and significant transactions, and the small room at the end of the hall was beneath his notice which meant that over 6 years it had become, without either of them formally acknowledging it. Lauren sat in the chair. Daniel appeared in the doorway. He looked at the room, at the plants and the books and the lamp and the small particular order of a space that belongs completely to one person. "This is where you went," he said, not a question. "This is where I went," she said. He leaned against the doorframe. "What did you do in here?" Reed sued sometimes as thoughts sat. She looked at the window box. "Talked to the plants." "Did they talk back?" "One of them is particularly communicative." Daniel smiled. Lauren looked around the room. She thought about the hours she had spent here. The mornings, the late evenings, the times when the weight of the marriage had become temporarily unbearable and she had needed to be somewhere that Nathan had not gotten inside. She had not understood in those moments that what she was doing was protecting something, that the room itself was a form of resistance, that the self she brought into this room and set down in this chair was the self she was refusing to surrender completely. She understood it now. "I'm keeping this room," she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Not the room specifically," she said. I'm keeping what I was in here. I'm keeping her." She paused. "I spent a long time being afraid she was going to disappear. That if I stayed long enough and got reduced enough, she would just stop existing." She looked at her brother. "She didn't." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "she didn't. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about rebuilding is simple, and Lauren had no illusions about that. She had heard enough stories of women leaving difficult marriages to know that the narrative of liberation was almost never as clean as it appeared from the outside. The courtroom moment was real. The shift she had felt walking down those steps was real. But the life on the other side of the shift was still a life complicated. Daily, full of moments that required navigation without the old landmarks. She stayed in the house on Briargrove while the legal process continued. Nathan moved out within 2 weeks, which Daniel had advised, and Nathan's counsel had recommended as the strategically sound choice given the court's findings. He left with what he had arrived with, essentially his clothes, his watch, his phone, his particular posture. He did not say anything to Lauren when he left. She was in the small room at the end of the hall when she heard the front door close. She listened to the sound of the house after he left. It sounded the same physically, same walls, same floors, same quality of silence, but the silence had a different texture now. Not the silence of a space where someone might appear at any moment and require something of you. Just silence, plain, ordinary, uncharged silence. She had forgotten what that sounded like. She sat in the chair and listened to it for a long time. The forensic accounting process took 11 weeks. Daniel had predicted it would take between 8 and 14, and he was right on his midpoint estimate, which Lauren was beginning to understand was his general approach to expectations accurate to the middle, honest about the range, never promising more certainty than the situation contained. The forensic accountants found more. Of course they did. The 3 entities Daniel had not been able to fully trace turned out to contain an additional $3,800,000 in assets that had been moved over a 4-year period preceding the divorce. Not in one large transfer, in increments, methodical and patient, the financial equivalent of the way Nathan did everything slowly, quietly, making each individual move small enough not to attract attention, while the cumulative effect was enormous. When Daniel called Lauren to tell her the forensic findings, she was sitting at the kitchen table. She had a cup of tea in front of her. She had been reading, actually reading, not staring at words while her mind was somewhere else, actually reading and following the story, which was something she had not been able to do properly in years because some part of her brain had always been monitoring, always listening, always pre-calculating the next thing. She had been reading and drinking tea, and it was a Tuesday morning, and she had nowhere to be until 11. This was what her life looked like now. She was still getting used to it. $3,008,000, she said when Daniel told her. $3,840,000, to be precise, he said. Precise is good, she said. The total documented dissipated assets are now just over $10 million, Daniel said. Combined with the marital equity in the properties and the business valuation adjustment following the independent operational analysis, we are looking at a settlement figure that is significantly different from the one Nathan presented on the morning of the hearing. Lauren thought about the morning of the hearing. Nathan's charcoal suit, his laugh, the papers scattered across the floor, the 11 minutes in the parking garage. How significantly different, she said. Daniel told her the number. She set her teacup down very carefully. She sat for a moment with the number inside her. 10 years ago, she would not have been able to imagine that number existing in any context that was related to her. 5 years ago, she had been managing a grocery budget that barely made it to the end of the month after Nathan froze the primary account. 2 years ago, she had been sitting in this same kitchen, at this same table, writing in a hidden notebook and telling herself that what she was recording was real. "Okay," she said. Lauren, Daniel said. "Are you all right?" "I'm more than all right," she said. I'm sitting here thinking about that folder, the worn folder." "Yes," she said. "I walked into that building with a worn folder and the contents of that folder, and this is what was actually true. Underneath everything he built to cover it, this is what was actually there." Daniel was quiet for a moment on the phone. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what it is." The employment interference investigation produced a separate finding 3 months after the hearing. The Family Law Investigative Unit, in coordination with the State Bar's referral, determined that Nathan's conduct in making false representations to employers on Lauren's behalf constituted tortious interference with prospective economic advantage. The finding opened a separate civil cause of action that Daniel filed on her behalf in the 4th month. Nathan's attorney attempted to settle that case quickly. Daniel declined the first 3 offers. He called Lauren after declining the 3rd. "He wants this to go away," Daniel said. "I know," Lauren said. "The offers are going to get better," Daniel said. "He doesn't want this case to go to trial, because at trial the recording comes in again, and the 14 phone calls has come in, and the story gets told to another room full of people, and he has spent his entire professional life managing his reputation, and he cannot afford for this story to be told in public more than it already has been." "What do you recommend?" Lauren asked. "I think we decline one more offer and see where he lands," Daniel said. "But ultimately, this is your decision, not mine." Lauren thought about it. She thought about Hargrove Partners, the Navy blazer. The 3 rounds of interviews and the practiced answers and the careful preparation and the warmth of the recruiter who felt sorry for her without telling her why. She thought about the 4 positions, the 4 times she had tried to rebuild something independent and been quietly, efficiently, and visibly destroyed. She thought about what it had cost her. Not the money was almost incidental at this point, given what the divorce settlement was now going to be. She thought about what it had cost in terms of belief. Each failed application had taken something from her that was harder to quantify than money. Each time she had assembled herself into a candidate, put her competence on the table, let herself want something, and then had it denied through no failure of her own, something in her understanding of herself had shifted slightly, had leaned slightly more toward Nathan's version of her and slightly further from her own. That was the actual cost, not the salary, the self. "Decline it," she said. "All right," Daniel said. Nathan's 4th offer was significantly higher than the 3rd. Daniel called her. "Your call," he said. "What would you do?" she said. He paused. "I would take it and invest the energy in the next chapter." "Why?" "Because continuing the litigation keeps him present in your life," Daniel said. "And I don't think you need him present in your life anymore. I think you have enough. I think you have more than enough. And I think the next chapter is more important than the next offer." Lauren sat with this. She thought about what it would mean to keep going. More depositions, more strategy calls, more mornings organized around Nathan Caldwell and what he had done and what she was still owed. More months of her life oriented toward him as a fixed point. She thought about the small room at the end of the hall. The chair, the plants, the books, the silence. She thought about Tuesday mornings with tea. "Take it," she said. In the 6th month after the hearing, Lauren went back to work, not because she needed to, the settlement had seen to that. She went back because the small room at the end of the hall had taught her something important. She needed a place where what she did mattered to people outside her own walls. She needed work the way some people need weather, for the reminder that there is a world beyond the interior of your own existence. She took a consulting position with a commercial real estate firm in Houston. Operations and contractor coordination. It was functionally exactly what she had been doing at Caldwell Development Group for 8 years, except that this time her name was in the contract. Her name was in the contract and there was a number beside it, and that number increased by a percentage each year that was specified in writing. Her first week, she sat in a meeting with 3 contractors and a project manager who had a problem she recognized, like a subcontracts dispute. It wasn't toward a delay that would cost the project both money and deadline. She recognized it because she had solved a version of it 3 times before. She listened for 20 minutes, then she spoke. She solved it in 45 minutes. The project manager looked at her afterward with an expression she remembered from the independent witnesses Daniel had called. the expression of someone who has just seen the full version of a capability they had only seen partially before. "Where have you been?" he said. It was a casual question. He meant it as a compliment, but Lauren held it for a moment. Where have you been? She had been in a house on Briargrove, she thought. She had been in a courtroom in Harris County. She had been in a parking garage for 11 minutes trying to find the courage to walk through a door. She had been in a small room at the end of a hall, talking to plants, protecting something she couldn't name until the day it turned out to still be there. "I've been getting here," she said. He laughed, taking it as a joke. She let him. Daniel visited Houston 4 months after the settlement was finalized. He stayed for a long weekend. They spent most of it doing ordinary things, eating at restaurants Lauren chose, walking through a neighborhood she liked, watching a movie on Saturday evening that they both agreed was only adequate but were comfortable enough with each other to say so. On Sunday morning, Daniel sat in the small room at the end of the hall while Lauren made coffee. He had asked to see it, the room she had described to him during one of their weekly calls as the place where she had held onto herself. He sat in her chair and looked at the plants in the window box. Lauren came in and handed him his coffee. He looked at the plants. "That one," he said, nodding toward the largest one on the left. "Is that the communicative one?" Lauren looked. "That's Iris," she said. "Of course she has a name. She has opinions," Lauren said. "She doesn't like it when I forget to water her. She becomes visibly dramatic." Daniel sipped his coffee. "I'm proud of you," he said, not looking at her, looking at Iris. Lauren sat on the edge of the small table. "For what specifically?" she said. "For not letting him finish," Daniel said. Lauren looked at him. "He was trying to finish you," Daniel said simply. "That's what all of it was. The money, the accounts, the phone calls, the settlement. He was trying to complete the project he started the day he decided you were convenient rather than essential. He was trying to write the final sentence of a story in which you ended up with nothing, and stayed that way." He looked at her now. "You didn't let him finish." Lauren held her coffee cup. She thought about the story. The version Nathan would have written if she had signed the papers. If she had never made the calls looking for attorneys. If she had not started the notebook, had not hidden it in the winter coat, had not driven to the courthouse that morning and sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes and then gotten out of the car. She thought about all the small moments of not finishing. The moments that had not looked like resistance because they were so quiet and so private and so unremarkable from the outside. The moment she had pulled out the notebook for the first time. The moment she had pressed the crease out of the navy blazer the night before. The moment she had gathered the papers off the floor and sat back down. All of it had been the same act, the act of continuing. "Neither did you," she said to Daniel. He looked at her. "You looked for 22 years, she said. "You stopped once and picked it back up. You built a file for 14 months. You flew in on a delayed flight and filed your appearance at 7:48 in the morning." She looked at her brother. "You didn't let him finish either." Daniel was quiet. Then he said, "No, I didn't." The room held them both in its ordinary, unhurried silence. The plants in the window box caught the morning light. Iris was for once not being dramatic. Outside, Houston was doing what Houston does on Sunday mornings, which is to say it was doing everything and nothing simultaneously, existing at its own enormous scale with its own indifference to individual stories. Lauren looked at the scar on her left palm, small, faint, almost invisible now, but there. She had carried it for 41 years through 14 moves and 1 marriage and 1 courtroom and 6 months of rebuilding and all the ordinary, extraordinary days in between. She had carried it without knowing that the person who had made it was carrying her in a file 14 months thick. She had carried it through every version of herself she had inhabited, every name she had answered to, every room she had walked into alone. It was still there. She was still there. And everything that had been built to erase her, the accounts moved in the dark, the calls made to closed offices, the diagrams drawn at kitchen tables, the laugh in a courtroom, the recording struck, shifted, and hidden and structured to disappear, all of it had failed. Not because she had been powerful. Not because she had been strategic or resourceful or in possession of any particular advantage. Because she had been stubborn in the most fundamental way a person can be stubborn. She had been stubborn about existing. She had refused, in the most private and unglamorous way, to stop being herself. She had refused it in the small room at the end of the hall, and in the notebook in the winter coat, and in the 11 minutes in the parking garage, and in the moment she gathered the papers off the floor and sat back down. She had just kept being Lauren, and Lauren, it turned out, was more than enough. The story Nathan Caldwell wrote ended in a courtroom in Harris County, with a judge overruling his objections and ordering a forensic review and declining every settlement he proposed. The story Lauren Whitmore wrote was still going. It was going on a Tuesday morning with tea and an actually good book. It was going in a meeting room where she solved problems that other people brought to her. It was going on a Sunday in a small room at the end of the hall, with her brother in her chair and her coffee in her hand, and a plant named Iris being, for once, entirely undemanding. It was going forward. It would keep going forward. That was not a possibility or a hope or a careful optimism hedged against future difficulty. That was simply what was true. Lauren Whitmore was going forward, and she was not going alone.